Hi everyone, my name is Catherine and I'm the host of today's University of Sussex Scientific Society event. Today we're delighted to be hosting all the way from Canada, Dr. Samantha Nutt. She's a world-renowned humanitarian and founder of War Child Canada USA and War Child Canada and War Child USA. In addition to this, she has over 16 years of experience working in war zones. So tonight we're hoping to discuss quite a bit, from Sam's experiences as a doctor in war zones to humanitarian work across the globe, to her thoughts on COVID-19. But we'll also discuss her book, Damn Nations, Greed, Guns, Armies, and Aid. Normally I would show you this book, but I did buy the book on Kindle, but yes, eye-opening book, and I would recommend it to everybody here. This event will last for about an hour and will involve a discussion mixed in with a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please put it. So my co-host tonight is Scientific Society President Mahdi Murtaza, and I'll pass over to him to ask the first question. So without further ado, Sam, welcome to the Sussex Scientific Society.
All right. Well, I'm extremely excited for this event. Thank you, Kat, for the introduction. And so I guess, Sam, I'll ask you the question that is on everyone's minds, really, and that is COVID-19. It's been, I think, a pretty rough time, to say the least, for just about everybody in most places in the world. But I'd love to hear some of your reflections and some of your thoughts over, the last 12 months and how it's been for you.
Absolutely, and thank you, Mahdi, and thank you, Catherine, as well, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you virtually this evening. Look, I think obviously COVID-19 has been caused a great deal of upheaval and disruption to all of our lives, and it's also caused a tremendous loss of life, particularly among the most vulnerable and the seniors everywhere in the world. I think, from my perspective, as a global health doctor, but also as a humanitarian and as someone who's spent the last now, frankly, quarter century going in and out of different war-torn areas and seeing the great inequities that exist, particularly when it comes to access to healthcare. I think that the pandemic has really exacerbated some of those inequalities, but also highlighted them. And by way of example, right, even as we begin among wealthier nations to roll out our vaccination strategies, although in Canada that's hit quite a few roadblocks because we don't have our own manufacturing capabilities, and so our rollout here has been quite delayed relative, for example, to the United Kingdom and the United States. But even if you look at the progress that what we often call high-income countries have been able to make towards achieving 50% or more vaccination coverage rates, we're on that fast track to be able to achieve that and for our lives to go back to hopefully a relative degree of normal sometime in the next 6 months. But then if you look at many of the countries in which War Child's working, countries that are already plagued by war and by poverty, that already have difficulty accessing healthcare services, running a cold chain, delivering safe and effective vaccination coverage. And if you look at the inequities in terms of their access to vaccination programs and COVAX, for example, and the lack of opportunity through that program, they're looking at maybe achieving 50% vaccination coverage rate sometime into 2023 or even 2024. And from a practical point of view, in many of the environments in which War Child's working, that may not even be achievable, even if those vaccines are available because of violence and instability. So overall, I think that it has, in some ways, it has demonstrated our interconnectedness as human beings, but paradoxically, unfortunately, I think it has also demonstrated our capacity as nation states for fairly profound self-interest when times prove to be quite challenging, and that's really unfortunate because I think in the years ahead we're going to be seeing deepening inequalities and a more challenging pandemic environment as a result of that.
Thank you very much, Sam. And, I think there's so much to unpack there. You're absolutely right about the widening inequalities and inequities. I think they've never been perhaps as stark as they have at the moment, or at least in the public eye. But I want to talk specifically about one of the things you mentioned early on, which is War Child. Now, in Kat's introduction, she gave an overview of your career, but I think we and the audience would love to hear sort of your career in your own words. If you could describe a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. And I promise I won't make every answer as long as the last one, or we won't get through your list of questions.
Take as long or as little as you like. We're here to listen to you.
So yeah, I'm a medical doctor, and I actually did my master's of public health in developing countries at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and then completed my residency in public health, but also in family medicine. And for me, I have always been, even when I was much younger and in university, profoundly interested and committed to the rights of women and girls, and looking at, for example, the impact of inequalities and violence and abuse on girls and women especially. And so when I was studying at the London School, I had an opportunity to work with UNICEF in war-torn Somalia to combine some of my thesis research around the impact of violence on women's health. And then that did lead me to Somalia during the famine. And, I'm not somebody, it's interesting, if you had said to me back when I was a medical student that I would someday be a public health doctor and be working on the issue of conflict and health, and going in and out of different war-torn countries for most of my career, that's not something I would have predicted for myself. I'm small. I don't fit the sort of overarching stereotype of the like brawling, emergency room doctor who sweeps in and saves lives. As a public health doctor, we're definitely more interested in the determinants of health and in prevention than the sort of nitty-gritty business of reattaching people's arms and that kind of stuff. But for me, once I had witnessed war and experienced war firsthand and seen the very profound and devastating impact that it has on the lives of millions of people throughout the world, and still does now, and also begun to understand how many of the approaches that we have to addressing issues of war and poverty and the rights of women and the abuses of women and girls throughout the world, why so many of those approaches are so deeply flawed, that to me was really sort of profoundly psychically changing. And as a result of that, I spent several additional years working with different UN agencies before realizing that there was a real gap in our international humanitarian response, and then that led to the creation of War Child Canada.
So you mentioned that you were offered this opportunity with UNICEF at 25. I'm kind of wondering what you initially expected from the experience and how that differed from reality.
Yeah, well, at the time I was recruited because, again, I was doing my thesis research around the impact of war on women's health. And it was at a pivotal moment in that country's history. So this was during the second wave of famine that had gripped that part of the world. And it was right after the withdrawal of troops that were deployed during Operation Restore Hope. And it was also on the heels of the Rwandan genocide. And as a result of the Rwandan genocide, Somalia had gone from having more than almost 50 international humanitarian organizations that had been deployed to the country to respond to the famine. And within the span of 6 months of the Rwandan genocide, there were fewer than about 12 that were remaining in the country. And they had been responsible they had set up the entire humanitarian response, and basically were people's only source of healthcare at the time, because it was a failed state. There was really no functioning government. And so when I left for Somalia as part of this team to look at what the needs were, how the UN should configure its humanitarian response in the wake of this mass exodus of all of these different actors, I left feeling pretty confident about the skills that I had acquired and my capacity as a physician to do what we're trained to do, which is really essentially to, save lives. And what I was confronted by in Somalia really, I think, it made me really understand just how deeply flawed so many of those humanitarian interventions are, and how so often the emphasis is slapping on band-aids, but not actually getting to the root causes that contribute to such violence and instability in the first place. Whether those root causes are a history of colonialism, whether it is global financial inequalities, whether it is the rampant proliferation of arms to unstable parts of the world that the sale of which directly benefits wealthier countries, whether it is a humanitarian infrastructure that is staffed by, in this case, mostly foreign personnel who were dangerously disconnected from the local population and who often went about their business without meaningfully and strategically engaging the very people that their interventions were designed to serve. That, to me, was a real eye-opener around the limitations of humanitarian aid, but also its very concrete failings. And it also exposed me to the underlying causes of some of that violence and what needed to change in order to prevent those atrocities in the first instance.
So you talk about those underlying causes, and it's really interesting to hear, but I can't help but think about a little bit of intersectionality here, as you've highlighted in your answer. Did you ever feel like that put you in a bit of a sticky situation to deal with those underlying causes? Because doctors throughout the world are expected to remain sort of above the fray of political discourse and dealing with those issues that people say should be left to the politicians. Doctors should focus on patients. But if these are such intertwined issues, how do you deal with that? How is there any kind of mental gymnastics that need to take place that allow you to sort of transcend that neutrality, if that makes any sense?
It does make sense. And I think that as doctors, it's really important that we're always critically examining the impact of our actions, particularly on our patients, on those that we should be serving. And medicine, to me, is really fundamentally, to be effective as a doctor, you have to understand and wrestle with the human experience, and you have to have, or you should have, empathy. And sorry, my dog is well, you'll hear from her occasionally. She's very small but has a big attitude.
She wants to make a guest appearance.
She does, yeah. So again, it comes down to empathy, and there are times in medicine, and I know that that often there is this sense that doctors shouldn't wade into politics or shouldn't really have an active voice in policy considerations. But if we are not part of advocating for our patients, especially those who are facing profound injustices, then frankly, to amplifying their voices, then not a lot will change. And so I do believe that there is a time and place when you have to advocate for your patients. You have to advocate for those that you serve. You have to advocate for the most vulnerable to ensure that they have access to the care that they need and that they should be entitled to. And so I very much see my role as a physician in this context, and particularly working in war zones with local communities. It's not my job to take that over. It's not my job to usurp their voices, but if I can amplify their voices, if I can draw attention to their stories, to their experiences, to give them that opportunity and that platform to enable them to then have the opportunity to rebuild their lives in the way that they would choose to rebuild their lives, then that's something that I feel very passionately about, and that's something that we try to do every day at War Child Zero programming.
Yeah, so a point that stood out to me when I was reading this book and was a little bit about what the people in the countries needed and the kind of aid that they actually received. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this issue and why War Child is different from maybe humanitarian organizations that seem to actively try not to meet the long-term needs of the people they're trying to help.
Well, there are different kinds of humanitarian organizations, right? There are the ones that focus uniquely on short-term needs, so food, water, shelter, blankets, vaccinations. And it's understandable that in certain contexts, particularly in complex humanitarian emergencies, where you're facing famine, where you're facing displacement, where people are struggling and really unwell, that you have a need for those short-term measures. But at the same time, we know that conflicts throughout the world, it's rarely the case that it goes on for 6 months or 1 year. These conflicts usually take place over many, many years, and the needs of populations will change over time. And if you're constantly focusing on those short-term interventions, a few things happen. I mean, one, you can unwittingly create a cycle of dependency where people feel hopeless and helpless, and they're just entirely dependent on handouts. And two, you get a certain degree of international fatigue around providing the level of support that those populations need, making them even more vulnerable. So unless you work comprehensively to enable those communities to participate in the solutions that are needed to really begin to rebuild their lives and to maintain their healthcare, you're going to be caught in this constant cycle of dependency, deepening inequality, deepening poverty, deepening violence, deepening abuse, which also predisposes kids, for example, to recruitment by militia groups, because it's one of the only ways they can protect their families and earn an income. So War Child exists to really prevent those, to prevent violence and conflict, and to prevent those unintended outcomes. So we work exclusively with local community groups. 99% of our staff throughout the world are local for War Child Canada. All of our country directors, which is the most senior level within our field programming operations, are either national or regional actors, so they know the community extremely well. And we've got more than 400 staff throughout the world. They design the programs, which are based around education, catch-up learning for kids, so that those deficits as a result of displacement, as a result of violence, loss of education, don't become lifelong. We work in the area of ending sexual and gender-based violence, including training local lawyers and paralegals, and working to uphold and defend the rights of women and children as part of a child protection strategy. And then the third part of what we do is what we call opportunity, which is really focused on economic empowerment, so that communities and families can then provide for themselves and not be so dependent on this external infrastructure that gets set up. And we work alongside, where it's appropriate, with local government, ministries of education, for example, to ensure that all of those efforts are desirable and sustainable, and again, are locally appropriate and locally led.
No, thank you. Gosh, it really is striking to hear you talk about these issues in a way that I think only somebody that's seen them up close firsthand and has spent a lot of time there experiencing these can talk about them. And I do want to move the conversation a little bit towards that. And, reading your book, you're very open and you're very honest, sometimes brutally so, about some of the descriptions of things like sexual assault and abuse that women face in these regions. And I can't help but think, and we talked about this on Friday when we spoke before the event, that when you look at things like popular culture, whether it be through music, films, television, video games even, do you feel that we too often gloss over what these very harsh realities are of life in these devastated areas?
We do, absolutely, Madi. And we also, there's this kind of cognitive dissonance, I think, where we presume, especially those of us who were fortunate enough to be born into wealthier democratic environments, where we think that we're disconnected from the problem of war, and we might see it in it or participate in a video game, or we might read about it, but we don't necessarily internalize that struggle, or even on a very basic level empathize with that struggle. Even if you look at contributions to international humanitarian assistance, especially, I'll give Canada as an example. I mean, less than 10% of Canadian donations each year go to support international humanitarian causes. I know the UK is aiming, coming out of the pandemic, to increase its official development assistance, its ODA, back up to 0.7%, which is the UN target. Canada's been at half of that, for more than 20 years, roughly. And even still, as we look at coming out of the pandemic and the tremendous debt that countries have accrued, I can only imagine that ODA will be one of the biggest targets for cuts to be able to offset the pandemic spending. And so to get to your point, the impact of sexual and gender-based violence in some environments can be directly connected to some of the opportunities and privileges that we enjoy as citizens of wealthier nations. And we're often totally ignorant, unaware of those realities. The Congo is a really good example. One of the hardest stories hardest experiences that I have personally participated in, and I was working in the Eastern Congo at one of War Child's locally supported children's education centers, and a young girl by the name of Nadine came up to me, and I was sitting in this back office and I'm writing a report, and I'd been interviewing young people all throughout the day, which I usually do because obviously we want their feedback and their input into how we can improve our programs. And she knocked on the door and she asked if she could speak with me, and I presumed that she wanted to talk about the program and how we could make it better. But she had a completely different agenda, and she started our conversation. We were speaking in French, and she started off by saying to me, "Do people back home where you're from, do they understand what's going on in places like the Congo?" And this is a question that I get asked a lot because people want more than anything else to know that their suffering is not going unnoticed and unacknowledged. And it's a very hard question to answer. And I had been sitting there, I was, as I said, writing up this report, and I had my computer in front of me and my cell phone, and she started to explain to me how she had been very, very violently assaulted a few months prior, to the point where when she got up to run, some of the young boys who assaulted her ended up trying to cut off the soles of her feet. And she showed me these very thick scars that she had from running from her heels to her toes on both sides. And we discussed the fact that in the Eastern Congo anyway, what is helping to fuel and finance this conflict is the tremendous amount of mineral wealth that is being extracted from that part of the world, which includes a mineral called coltan, which is also called tantalum, which can be found in most of our cell phones and our computers and our video game consoles. And the last words that Nadine, who is in her early teens, said to me that day as she was leaving, she turned and she said, in French again, she said, looking at me in my computer, she said, all of this is for you. We die for nothing. And those stories, that reality, the ways in which we can cultivate and contribute to that level of violence and instability, and yet be blissfully, I think, naively unaware that it implicates us all as human beings. Overcoming that, I think, is going to be really important in the years ahead of us, especially as we begin to address in this moment of cultural awakening issues around anti-Black racism and the impact of colonization on different communities throughout the world. And that is a legacy that endures to this day, and that harms young girls like Nadine. And we think we're not active participants in it as modern progressive people, but we can be, because it's in everything we do every day.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I remember reading that chapter in the book, and I think when you linked it to the the mineral wealth, and that was kind of linked to some of the violence that was seen in that area. I don't think that a lot of people, especially in the UK, the US, Canada, think about war like this and think about the things they do in their lives, how it can affect people, quite far away. I was just kind of wondering, piggybacking off what Madi said, you do talk a lot about the sexual and gender-based violence towards women, but in war zones. But what strategies are effective in stopping this?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a few of them. And I should add as well, because I know most people watching are in the UK, there's a terrific group called Global Witness in the UK, which has done really, I think, important research and advocacy on the issue of coltan and conflict-free mineral resources. So if that's something people are interested in, they should definitely check out Global Witness. I strongly recommend it. On the issue of sexual gender-based violence, there are different strategies to approach it. And the most successful strategies are ones that are integrated. And so, for example, women and girls, but particularly young girls like Nadine, they do need access to basic services and to healthcare to help them overcome their experience of war, the trauma that they have endured, the stigma that many of them face, for example, the horrific injuries that many of them face, the risk of HIV/AIDS as well. So definitely making sure they have access to those kinds of treatment programs is critically important, and psychological support is critically important. But more than that, for example, in the Eastern Congo, and this is one of the areas where War Child has been working, families, because of the high rates of sexual and gender-based violence in many communities, take the decision to hold their girls back from school because the journey is so perilous and they risk being assaulted on the way. And in that situation, they're more vulnerable to further abuse, but they're also missing out on years of their education, and they may end up in early child marriage. So we, in that situation, have been running distance-based learning programs within those communities using the very basic technology of radio to allow girls within those communities to participate with teaching supports in that education, and boys participate as well. They're community-based, but predominantly it is benefiting the girls. And in fact, our evaluations have shown that girls who participate in these programs are graduating, they're matriculating with their exams at a higher rate than even the national average. And we're rolling this out to about 500,000 Congolese young people in the next few months. So it's, to me, making sure they have an education and they have opportunities in life, really, really important. Earning an income to be able to take decisions that benefit themselves personally, that's really, really important. So that level of empowerment. But the fourth part of it, I guess, really is around legal protection. So in my mind, access to justice and the rule of law are the kind of missing piece of international humanitarian action. And it can be achieved in different ways. I'll give you one example. We're a registered law firm War Child is in Afghanistan, working with local lawyers and paralegals to actually defend and uphold the rights of women and girls, many of whom have been sentenced as a result of what are called moral crimes. And you can imagine what a moral crime looks like in a place like Afghanistan, right? For example, if you're abducted and trafficked and then you refuse to marry your rapist, they will arrest you as the young girl, but not arrest the person who trafficked you. And they will languish in prison sometimes with their young children. And so we have gone into the prisons and have been actively defending some of those women and girls to either reduce their sentences or to see them, completely released from custody. And those are just a few examples of you need opportunities and you need stability, but you also need decisive strengthening of the legal mechanisms that exist to be able to enforce the rule of law. It's not always possible. In some places, the judicial infrastructure is in a complete disarray or totally non-existent. But in many environments, particularly in places where you might have a large refugee population, there is an opportunity to intersect with the judicial system that exists and to try to address some of those human rights violations.
Yeah, so a lot of these places that you've been to, like the stories that you have of the kind of violence that women are, on the receiving end of, these are obviously often quite dangerous places to be a woman. So I'm wondering, when you worked in areas like Somalia, Congo, Iraq, Liberia, what made you go back? Despite these being quite dangerous places?
For me, I have the great privilege, really, of bearing witness and knowing some of the most courageous and amazing women on earth, women who are born into extremely difficult circumstances, who live lives that are very, very challenging, who have come to experience sexual violence themselves, and who get up every single day and do extraordinary things for other women and girls to address some of that that violence and instability. And so what drives me to continue to go back is to make sure that those investments in those amazing local women continue, that they have the opportunity to really to lead on these issues and to see change through, and to find solidarity in a broader international network of women who are there to help support and to help facilitate. So that's what keeps me going. Sorry, my dog's gonna keep on barking for 1 second here, but I'm sure she'll recover in a second if the door doesn't keep going. So that's it for me. I mean, I've been hugely inspired by the tremendous people that I've met throughout the world, and it always seems like an insane indulgence to me to say, well, I'm tired, or it's too difficult, or there's too much upheaval, or there's too much of a personal risk, because I know the risks that they face every day.
Yeah. Wow. So I mentioned that I wanted to ask you about this, like in the kind of the other call that we had, but you mentioned your experience talking to women in Somalia about female genital mutilation. And I kind of want to ask you how prevalent this issue is globally, and how prevalent was it, in your experience talking to women, and maybe a little bit on what the longer term physical and psychological effects maybe of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are different forms of female genital mutilation, and in terms of the level of injury and the ultimate disruption to women's reproductive health. And it can range from partial clitoridectomy or to the complete, in Somalia, it's called the infibulation type, which is the complete removal effectively of a woman's labia and external genitalia, and then they'll sew it back up and leave a very small hole for the passage of urine and menstrual products. And it is, unfortunately, certainly while I was there in the 90s, it's very widely practiced in Somalia and other parts of the Horn of Africa. There are different versions of it too that are practiced in West Africa and in North Africa, including in Egypt. But in Somalia, it was quite profound, and the level of scarring that takes place means that women, unfortunately, often when they give birth, they end up with massive amounts of tearing because the women's anatomy just can no longer expand to be able to accommodate the act of giving birth, and it can leave them with fistulas, which is where the sort of passageway between the vagina and the rectum ends up opening up, and then they no longer have control over their bowels, and again it can result in a huge amount of pain, disability, stigma. And it can take several operations to be able to properly correct. If you'd like, I can just see if I can, are you picking up my dog a lot here? Because I can see if someone in the house can go and check on her here. It's one of the pitfalls of Zoom. I apologize.
No, not at all. No, I think, I don't think we can hear it anymore, but that's okay. That's absolutely fine. I think we are all dog friendly here, so it's not a problem in any way. So I just want to follow up with some of Kat's questions and sort of change tack just a little bit, but I do have a bit of a personal question for you, if you don't mind. And I appreciate that this might be a little bit of a heavier question, but when people apply to medicine, one of the first things they say is that don't go in with like rose-tinted glasses. They say you should have an awareness and an appreciation for what the difficulties of that career is. And, a big part of it is that the emotional resilience that you need to be able to cope with seeing patients from sometimes from very difficult backgrounds who've suffered greatly. And I think I have an immense respect for you and those in your field who, I think you've got patients in our own countries in the West that have very difficult lives, but it's perhaps so much more worse for people in these war-torn countries. And I guess my question is, in a nutshell, like, how do you cope with that level of suffering that you see and that you have to try and empathize with on a daily basis while you are there?
I think in those situations, the best thing to do is to really acknowledge it. You certainly can't run from it. You can't hide from it. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. You can't deal with it by just shoving it to one side. You have to talk about it, to acknowledge it, to find others who have witnessed and lived through similar kinds of experiences, and to draw strength from that. But I do think that you don't ever become immune to, at least I certainly don't, the horrific things that you see or hear. It is shocking, it is disturbing, it is appalling, and acknowledging that it's shocking and disturbing and appalling is what drives you to try to stop it. And I'm not unique in that way. I think any physician who has worked in a war-torn environment, anybody who's lived through war, understands that it is the worst that we are capable of as human beings. It is the greatest human tragedy that exists, and and we should be horrified by that as an outcome, and we should. That should drive us to want to stop it from happening every single day. And that's something I think that we don't, from 30,000 feet, it's easy to forget the very real human tragedy that war breeds. It seems like a game of strategy and nations against nations, but up close, war is really personal. And the people that you will find in life who are the most vehemently anti-war and pro-peace, even going back to our grandparents from the Second World War, those are the people who've lived with war, and it changes you. And that's okay. It's okay to acknowledge that.
I can't even begin to try and empathize what that experience must be like. But I can see that we're starting to get a few audience questions in as well, so I will touch on some of those. And so I guess this is one. We've got one about sort of how people can get involved with the charity, but I think I'll save that for right at the end, so we can let you speak on that a little bit. But we've got a question here from Alex, who said, "How can medical students prepare for working in the conflict zones as a doctor?"
That's an excellent question. I guess my response to that would be, first of all, is that really what you want to do, and to ask hard questions around why you might want to do that. And that will really shape which path you're on, because ultimately your contribution as a doctor depends too on what your skills are, right? So for me, as a public health doctor, I'm actually not doing the sort of hardcore emergency Doctors Without Borders MSF style work. I rarely do any clinical medicine unless somebody really asks me to, by bringing their sick child to me when I'm working in those environments. Because I'm a public health doctor, we're really about population-based interventions that will maximally benefit the largest number of people. And so that's, again, why we focus on education, access to justice, and opportunity, because we know from a public health point of view that that's what leads to better health outcomes and disrupts the cycle of poverty. So for me, the training that I bring is much more on the program management side, the evaluation side, my knowledge of epidemiology, my knowledge of evidence-based practices, my capacity to fundraise, to write reports, to measure outputs, all this kind of stuff. That's what I bring as a physician in terms of technical skill. Whereas somebody else might be, really great at teaching fistula repairs, and might really be able to teach a generation of other doctors within those environments to be able to do that kind of job. So in terms of how to best prepare, I would say do what you love. Do what you love. And if you really are committed to doing this kind of work, you will find a way to give back.
Right. Thank you. No, that's really interesting. And yeah, it's nice, I guess, for me personally, and I feel Kat will agree with me, to hear this out loud as well as being able to read it in your book. And I guess, my question originally was going to be, do you have anything coming up? But I think I already know the answer to that question. And so I'll say something, and then I'd like you to tell us a bit about it. And that is Push Back: The Unfinished Business of Women Everywhere.
The unfinished book of Samantha Nutt everywhere. So yes.
I mean, it says December 31st, 2023, according to my friend Google here.
Yeah, maybe. It's interesting. I started this book obviously before the pandemic, and I was really looking at, and Madi, you mentioned this before, which is a huge concern of mine, the intersection between issues of inequality and violence against women, misogyny, extremist thought, the rise of ultranationalist movements throughout the world, the phenomenon of Trump, and what is all of this doing to really, I think, set back the progress of feminism and also racial justice and other really pressing issues. And so that's where it sort of started. And I was looking at incels, and I was looking at, again, Trump and ultranationalism through Europe and white supremacy and extremism, and how this kind of all comes together to create, I think, one of the biggest threats that we've seen in modern history. And then the pandemic hit, and then fortunately, at least for the United States of America, Trump was booted out of office. Hooray for the planet! But although much of what he espoused, I think, still remains, unfortunately, and needs to be addressed going forward. So now I'm in the process of rethinking how this all looks, and I'm looking at how the pandemic is compounding a lot of these issues. We do know, in terms of women's participation in the workforce, at least in North America, it's at a 30-year low. And we do know that some of the inequalities that existed before the pandemic have only now been amplified. So I've got to get back in the saddle and finish it, rework it and finish it before my publisher no longer allows me to leave the house.
Well, I think I speak for both Kat and I when I say that I think we're very much looking forward to it. But it's quite interesting because you're not just known for your books. I think people may have also seen you in your TED Talks. And also there was a very interesting interview you did for, I think it was Now This, specifically about something that's become a bit more prominent recently, and that is volunteer tourism or voluntourism. And you had some really interesting insights about that. So I thought if you could share a few of those, I'd really appreciate it.
I do want to talk about that, and I also want to tell you a funny story. So Now This, when I was doing a bunch of segments for them, and then I would write them, and then when I was in New York, I would go in and I would shoot them with them. And so I wrote this one segment about the problems of voluntourism and how it is its own form of colonialism, especially if it's done without consideration for communities on the ground that it's supposed to be helping. And I'll talk about some of the pitfalls of voluntourism in a second. But so there I am in New York, and I was taping like 4 of them, and then I ended up running out of costume changes. And so thankfully the producer said, "Well, just grab something." So I grabbed this. Now you have to watch this. You'll never look at this video again the same way. This pink frilly pajama top, and put it on. I was like, "Well, does this look enough like a top?" He's like, yeah, just go. So I tape it. And this was the one I thought that no one would pay attention to. And then like within 2 months, something like 18 million people had seen it. So I had friends of mine from all over were saying to me, "Hey, that was a really interesting thing on Now This. Were you wearing a pajama top?" Anyway, let that be a lesson to you kids, make better fashion choices. But what I will say about this is, look, too often we have, I think, believe that we're doing the right thing and that all you need is altruism. But there are parts of the world that are plagued by the misspent altruism of those who naively believe that they're doing well. And my point in that whole segment was really, if you're going to consider working in especially an emergency environment, a complex humanitarian environment, you have to be qualified and you have to know what you're doing. And this kind of busy work philanthropy where you might spend money and go overseas and, you know, engage in some kind of token exercise of rebuilding a school or reading to orphans, that you can in that process be doing more harm than good. You can be cutting local people out of paying jobs. You can be exposing young children to a revolving door of well-intended foreigners who in some instances haven't even been vetted from a child protection point of view. And those foreigners then form emotional bonds with these kids and vice versa. And then those bonds are shattered after their 2-week stay. So, you know, we really do have to ask ourselves very hard questions about what we're doing, who it's helping, and whether the approach that we're taking is what's truly necessary if we want to promote some degree of social change. And it's a chapter that I really explore in more detail in Damned Nations as well, and give very concrete examples of the ways in which our good intentions have caused more harm. You know, you can also draw a direct line between the exchange and sale of used clothing originating from wealthier countries that were sent to Africa that resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of domestic textile jobs within Africa. So again, we have to, you know, we think we're doing a good job, but good intentions are not enough. You have to understand the unwitting implications of your actions.
You mentioned, so like the volunteer tourism thing, you know, it has this allure, like you go online, you see, you know, a picture of someone, you know, doing fun activities like kayaking, and then, you know, later on going and taking like a selfie in like an orphanage and stuff. So it has this kind of like allure where you get to feel good by doing, you know, charity work, and then also get to have a bit of a holiday. And I'm kind of wondering, like, you mentioned that you have always been like interested in humanitarian work. Have you ever, when you were younger, did you ever feel like the pull of volunteer tourism? Did you ever like consider signing up for one of those kind of groups, or was it, yeah?
You know, the thing is, when I was younger, it wasn't really, it wasn't such a big industry as it is now. Particularly for a few years, there's this kind of volunteer expedition thing where you might go, and there are some good ones, right? If you're doing more of an environmental, for example, experience, and maybe you're, I don't know, trying to plant trees in the rainforest, like that, I can kind of see as maybe useful labor. But when you start intersecting with human beings, then you raise some really fundamental questions about whether you're the best person for that job, and whether that's the best use of your resources, and whether that's actually what they need and they are asking for. And so I do draw a distinction between that. And what I'll say to people all the time is, look, if you want to go on vacation, well, I mean, you can't right now because it's COVID, but if you, in normal times, if you want to go on vacation, go on vacation, right? Like, go to Africa for example, is a vast and beautiful and wondrous continent. Learn about its history, learn about its people, spend all your tourist dollars in local markets, particularly the ones that support local women's cooperatives. You know, that in and of itself will help, right? And will expose you to a different part of the world and a different way of seeing the world. But you don't need busy work philanthropy, right? This idea that somehow you get up and you lay a bunch of bricks, and then in the middle of the night somebody comes and takes down those bricks so that the next group can lay the same bricks. I mean, it's silly, and it's sending the wrong message to kids. And I often say to university administrators as well, is that we need to stop rewarding those kinds of volunteer experiences as well when we're thinking about who we're going to accept to our master's degree programs or our medical schools, right? Because then you're giving preferential treatment to the kids that could afford to spend that kind of money for that feel-good expedition to put at the very top of their CV, while you're marginalizing the kid who did the night shift at Starbucks to be able to pay for tuition. And I tell you what, in the end, which of those kids will probably make a better doctor? You know, the kid who worked the night shift at Starbucks, because, you know, there's somebody who knows what it's like to to struggle and to work hard, and also to be sleep deprived. So it's to me, it's we just have to start valuing those experiences differently, and start educating, I think, people around what truly makes a difference. And what makes a difference is investing in local communities, because they're the ones who know best what those communities need.
Okay.
Sorry, now I'm ranting.
No. I love ranting. Ranting is great. That's what we all came here for.
At least I'm not in a pajama top. So.
I mean, you could be in pajama bottoms. We wouldn't know.
Well, I might be, yes, but you do have to have, if you work in war zones, you do have to have a sense of humor. That's all I'll say.
So I've got an audience question. Yeah, going back to war for a second. So she says, Jen says, do you think that political campaigning in the UK or America has a capacity to influence the nature and intensity of war abroad?
Political campaigning? Yeah, I mean, there are different ways to unpack that question. I think that certainly there are examples of, especially on the ultra-nationalist side and the populist side, where stoking the embers of fear of the other, and fear of refugees and migrant workers, and demonizing other countries and their people, where that can score you some cheap political points and appeal to your base. I think there's no, in my mind anyway, there's very little question about that. But the reality is that over time, what that does is it not only does it degrade public discourse, but it also creates a more antagonistic, fearful, combative, divisive population. And we need to get back to a place really where we're understanding the role of diplomacy and multilateralism. And when we're looking at other nation states, not just in terms of what they can do for us from an economic point of view, but how we can work together to advance, advance humanity. And I would have hoped that would have been one of the big lessons coming out of the pandemic. You would think right now, especially, we would understand that for as long as this pandemic exists anywhere in the world, life can't return to normal for any of us. And yet our behavior suggests that we're still primarily self-interested within that equation. And I don't know. So that's the first part of the question, is do I think that politicians can do that to get elected? I mean, some do, unfortunately they do. But I also believe that politics and running for government and supporting those who espouse your values and your vision for the future, that is incredibly important, because the only way good people get elected to politics is if other good people invest in them and support them and back them. And it's a hard job, and it's getting harder all the time, and it can be a dangerous job because you're out there in the public and you receive threats, and especially for women. And so I think unfortunately that's forcing a lot of really good people to reconsider whether they want to go into politics. So I'm always in favor of finding people who you believe in and backing them. Campaign for them. It's hard. It's hard going door to door. Again, in non-COVID times, it's hard going door to door to grow support for a political candidate. You get yelled at and screamed at and pushed off the front stoop and all kinds of stuff. But ultimately, that's where change happens.
Right, thank you. I'm very conscious of time, even though we've got more and more audience questions coming in. So I'll ask just 2 more audience questions quickly, then we'll skip to quick fire. I guess the first question I'll ask, this is one I think that many people have tried to give an answer to. I certainly know that it comes up in medical school interviews all the time. But that is, it's from Elisa, and her question is, do you believe that empathy is a skill one can develop, or is it a quality that you are born with?
This whole nature versus nurture. My gosh, how long have we been debating this conversation? Thank you, Lisa. That was, I feel as if I should be answering this with a glass of wine. Look, I think empathy ultimately has to be, it certainly has to be taught. We have to teach it to our children. We have to demonstrate it to our children. We have to encourage them, even at a very, very young age, to imagine someone else's perspective and point of view. And we have to model that behavior as adults. So that's incredibly important. But I also think you can expand your skills when it comes to empathy through some fairly basic things. You know, one is active listening to people. Two is reading. You know, I know a lot of aspiring medical students who the last time they read a book was in high school. But there are few, like a nonfiction book or a fiction book from you know, cover to cover. But there are it's such a great way to really understand someone else's perspective and to occupy their space. So again, I'm strongly in favor of that. And it's funny, when I graduated from high school, before I went on to university, I had a scholarship to go to study in the UK. I was at Giggleswick, which is in North Yorkshire near Settle. And it was a scholarship for drama and 19th century romantic English literature. So as I said to you, you and Catherine on Friday, my parents almost lost the will to live. But the point there was that people would say to me, well, how did you go from drama to studying medicine? And I say to them, well, drama is the ultimate expression of empathy. You're really wrestling with and trying to understand someone else's lived experience. And I think that has actually probably served me a heck of a lot better as a practicing doctor than my study of organic chemistry. You have to be patient, you have to listen, you have to validate, you have to understand, and you have to be willing to look at a problem from someone else's point of view. And you can learn it, you can be born with it, but really, most importantly, you just need it.
Masterfully put. This last question from the audience is one that I think it's not often that you get to speak to the president and the founder of a branch of a charity, but we'll ask the head honcho, and that is, this is from Ritti, and that is, if she wanted to get a job or experience working with War Child, what sort of things would you be looking for? A medical background, skills, languages, previous experience?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I should preface this by saying that there is War Child UK. And even though we're all financially, legally, and operationally independent, we work together as a sort of federative entity. So if you're interested in volunteering with them or having some kind of campus chapter, I'm sure you could reach out to them and they would be happy. Rob Williams is the CEO. They'd be happy to provide you with some information. If you're interested in learning more about War Child Canada and War Child USA, you can definitely get in touch with us. And I think that we'll probably put the URL at the end of this talk, but it's warchild.ca is the easiest way to get a hold of us. And in terms of skills, you know, fundamentally, I'm the only doctor in fact, I'm the only doctor I know of that in the UK and Canada, really, that's on staff at War Child, because again, a lot of the people that work with us have backgrounds in communications, in project management, in finance, in advocacy, in campaigns, and you know, communication, like all that kind of stuff. And so really, you can have any kind of skill and background, and you know, a nonprofit organization is just like any other organization. It needs all different kinds of people to make it go. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing, at least for us in Canada, we have, you know, we do have volunteer positions to help support the work through the Toronto office. We don't send people overseas just because it's way too dangerous, because we have mostly national staff overseas. But we do hire a lot from those volunteer positions. So we might have somebody who starts a campus chapter. And if you're on Instagram, you can check out McGill, which is a Canadian university. They have a campus chapter and they're always posting all the time. And McMaster, which is War Child at Mac, has a campus chapter, and they run their own campaigns. And then we often will see the work that's being done there and be really inspired by it. And we have paid summer student jobs, and then they'll apply for the summer student jobs, and they get those jobs, and then they finish their degree, and then some of them come and work for us. And we've recruited a number of people in our office over the years through those kinds of programs. So the short answer is, whatever you're interested in, there is probably a role for you, unless you're, I don't know, want to be a nuclear physicist. And then the second answer is that it's about building your networks, being open to opportunities, creating opportunities, and sometimes just asking, like just get in touch, find out what's available, keep asking, and you never know what could come your way. Did that answer that question?
Yes.
Very well,
okay.
very
All
much
right.
so. I'm possibly tempted to start one up at Sussex as well.
There you go. And again, please just get in touch with me, and we're happy to. As I said, because all of our offices are independent, I don't know to what extent the UK office has campus chapters, but we do. So feel free to get in touch with us.
No, thank you so much. I think because of time, we're just going to ask you one quick fire question. They're normally 15 seconds in length.
Quick. All right, I'll be disciplined. Cool.
Go. Kat, go for it.
Sorry, trying to find our quick fire questions.
That's all right. If you want, I can just go for it. That's easier.
Yes, I have lost my
Sure.
quick fire questions.
That's absolutely okay. So, Sam, I am hosting a dinner party in a few weeks, and you're invited. And you get to bring three guests, who can be any figure from any field, from any time in history. And there are no language barriers or anything like that. So the question is pretty simple. Which three guests do you bring?
Well, Nelson Mandela would definitely be top of my list. And because you said alive or historical, right?
Yep.
Gandhi would be very, very top of my list. And let's see. And then probably Robin Williams, just because it would be hilarious. Do you even know who Robin Williams is?
Are you kidding? We're in the UK. Okay. We're not that unconscious then.
Actually, I did meet Robin Williams a few years before he passed away. Yes, I did. And I was pregnant with my son at the time. And it was at an event that we were doing, and he put his hands on my belly and then pretended to be my son trying to get out in this like crazy voice. And so the first person to give my son voice was Robin Williams. So that's probably why he popped into my mind.
Oh, that is actually I think you're the first person that's answered that question in a way that didn't include just scientists. So, I think, really, thank you for that. That was very, very nice. But I think
I wouldn't hate the question either. Some people hate that question.
No, I like it. I also would have, if I could have had a fourth, I would have invited Arthur Miller, the playwright, just because I think that so much of what he was writing about at that moment in history. And I had an opportunity to hear him speak, to hear him lecture at Oxford when he was a visiting fellow, when I was studying in the UK. And I just think so much of what he was writing about is so relevant to what we've been going through in the last few years too.
I think I might invite you to every single one of my dinner parties from now on, if those are the kind of guests that you're going to bring.
That's right. Me and my deceased friends. Yes, great.
Well, actually, also your husband, because he was a Minister of State for Health.
He was, yeah, Minister of Health for Ontario.
What a power couple, right? But I will pass over to Kat just to finish off. But for me, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak to you. And thank you for asking our questions. So Kat,
thank you so much. And thank you for reaching out to me too. It's been an honor to do this with all of you today.
So with, I think that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Thank you to our collaborators for this event. BSMS MedSoc, BSMS Research Society, and BSMS Emergency Medicine Society, and also BSMS Wilderness Medicine Society. I'd like to thank Maddie for being my co-host tonight, and Alex for handling the live stream. But most of all, thank you, Sam, for answering all our questions and taking some time out of your pretty busy day to schedule the talk with us. Yeah, and just again to promote your book, because I did love it, but I only have it on Kindle. So, yeah, but it was great. It was a real eye-opener for me. And if any of the topics we talked about today interest you, then you should definitely read this book. So this was our final event for before Easter. And I can't think of a better speaker to end our speaker series this term. So thank you again, Sam.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Madi. And if anybody wants to get a hold of me too, you can DM me through Instagram and stuff. You'll be able to find me. I'm kind of everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, so once more, I would like to encourage you all to buy Sam's book. It's very, very good. So thank you again.